From now on, whenever you hear these horns, just know you are now entering the blackness.
A conversation actually broke out around this morning because Obama went up and he said he made this particular argument, and one of the things, one of the numbers that floats around the most is the 77 cents to $1. And folks, including myself, pointed out that seems to be slightly problematic when you say that, because we say 77 cents per dollar, but because even in Obama's speech this morning, he said 77 cents to $1, but it's worse for Black and Hispanic women. To me, this is immediately a bit of an issue because it kind of separates the folks in that way. And then the conversation around numbers and stats, like, well, what does it actually mean? What does it mean? So I actually reached out to an organization that has actually put out a report around this and around the issues of race when it comes to fair payment. And I believe we have Fatima Goss, of course, the name is Goss Graves. Fatima Goss Graves on the phone. Ma'am, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Hi, how are you, ma'am? Thank you so much for jumping on the show. We appreciate this a great deal.
Sure, happy to be here.
Excellent. So now, could you give us a breakdown? Because in your study, your report that you put out, you pointed out that it was 77 cents to $1 for men to women. But then it breaks down into race, and it gets very, very interesting. And by interesting, I mean terribly sad when you actually go a little bit deeper into it. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. The 77-cent stat is looking at all full-time working men and comparing them to all full-time working women. But when you look at the stats by race and gender together, you see that for African-American women and for Hispanic women, that the statistics are far worse when they are compared to white males. So for African-American women, they make only 64 cents to every dollar a white male makes. And Hispanic women, they're making only 54 cents to every dollar that a white man is making.
And that is, again, interesting. So on one hand, Amani, the conversation, like I said this morning, broke out, and folks, I was one of them who specifically said that the number that's being quoted here is more around white women, and people said, no, this the number is everyone, and as Fatima's pointed out, it is everyone, but according to the National Women's Law Center study, white women were at, I believe, 78 cents per dollar.
That's right. White women make 78 cents when compared to white men. So what you have is that Black women and Hispanic women are making less than white men. They're making less than white women. And even when you look at some of the states that are heralded as sort of the top places to be for having the smallest wage gap, like Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is really one of the worst places to be for African-American and Hispanic women.
Wait, no, don't say that about Chocolate City. You can't say that.
That's not Chocolate City, is it? New Orleans is Chocolate City.
No, they refer to D.C. as Chocolate
really?
City. Too. Yeah.
I thought it was just New Orleans.
But because, like, I believe when it comes down to being a Black one, because in Washington D.C. They say that it's around 90% the wage gap as opposed to the 77%. But then when it becomes for Black women, do you have the number for that?
Sure. For African-American women, they're making in Washington, D.C. around 56 cents when compared to white men, and Hispanic women are making around 48 cents when compared to white men. And again, when you're looking at women overall in Washington, D.C., they're making around 90% of men overall. So, I mean, you can see how when you're looking at race and gender together, particularly in some states, that the gap is even further exacerbated.
And now I noticed that you guys put out these numbers, and you specifically talked about women of color, because I've seen a lot of discussions around this not actually be around women of color. It's just women in general, and they leave out the racial component to the situation overall. I've been arguing, and I believe Amani would agree with me here, that to hide that aspect of it, not hide, but to not acknowledge the aspect of how race plays into all of this is to be a little bit disingenuous about the effects of it that it's having across the board when dealing with women.
Well, it's one of the reasons we think it's important to have very specific information. You need to have a lens of how women overall are doing. There's no question about that. But you also need to look at it by race and gender. And the actions that the president took today, I think what isn't getting a lot of pickup is that they are actions that are going to help with both race and sex-based pay discrimination. The two main actions that he took were having the ability to talk about wages and bringing more transparency, and then ordering the Department of Labor to collect data by race and by gender. This information will help to shine a light on employers' practices around pay.
Right. And Amani, did you want to ask something specifically on this?
No, I just think that it's important. I agree with you that when we talk about the 77-cent number, I think I sort of get a little bit frustrated with the ways in which women of color are sort of seen as separate and apart from women writ large, and that comes up a lot with voting, for example. When they say women voters voted this way, well, what they really mean is women of color tend to vote this way. So I guess my issue with the 78% number versus the 77 versus when you jump down to 64 and 54 is that the difference is so vast that it tends to obscure the real danger that women of color are in when it comes to fair pay.
And I won't point this out that and Fatima, tell me if I'm wrong, but the 77% number, that is it ends up averaging around that because of the population. Because I believe the numbers that you guys used for this, these were people who were working full-time year-round workers, and at the same time, just white women are in fact in higher numbers than black women and Hispanic women and Asian women in the overall I guess average, and that's why 78% with white women, and then the whole number being 77%. Am I crazy on that?
Right. So two things. When the 77-cent statistic is looking at all full-time workers year-round, men versus all women. Right. What we do when we compare by race and gender, we compare to white men typically. So when you compare white women to white men, they're making 78 cents on the dollar. When you're comparing Asian women to white men overall, it's about 82 cents on the dollar. And what's really unfortunate about some of the data around Asian women is that you can't disaggregate that further in many states, so you aren't able to see the real discrepancy between different groups of Asian women. So I think that number hides a lot too. I am with you. I think the 77-cent statistic in many ways hides the huge disparities that we're facing right now. But on the other hand, you have to have some measures. What's interesting is we are critiqued for not always looking at exactly apples to apples. Always comparing people living in a particular city doing a particular job. And one of the reasons that we don't do that is because we think that these overall statistics are real measures of broader workplace inequality for women, and that as soon as you get away from using the overall statistics, you forget that you need a number of solutions. So you need to have some stronger pay discrimination laws. You need things like higher minimum wage. You need pathways to higher paid non-traditional jobs. You need more policies in the workplace like paid sick days and paid leaves that are going to make it possible for men and women to both care for families and do their job. So I think it's important to have all of those numbers out, but to keep reminding people of the disparities, both the racial disparities within gender and how they play out together.
Indeed. And so also there were some interesting numbers because, like you pointed out, D.C., there was also some interesting numbers about California, because also California is looked at as this big liberal bastion, but yet the inequality here is also problematic in that way.
Oh yeah, California it's the story is actually sort of similar to DC, where women overall in California, when compared to men overall, are making almost 84 cents on the dollar. But African American women in California, compared to white men, are making 63 cents on the dollar. Hispanic women in California are making 43 cents on the dollar. And so, places like DC and California that are often touted as sort of having the smallest wage gap, if you aren't also talking about what's happening with women of color, you're going to miss that. So on the other hand, there are some places that have really tiny wage gaps for women of color, and many of those places also have really tiny numbers overall of African American and Hispanic women. So getting into the data can be tricky. One of the things, if you look at for African American women and for Hispanic women, a number of the states in the South are doing some of the worst. If you're looking at places like Louisiana and Texas and Alabama and where they're faring as well.
Oh dear. Now, okay, so looking at this is first of all, it's still very disheartening, and that's why I wanted to specifically have the conversation, because I thought it was great that you guys had put out this these numbers specifically in this way. Now, is there any studies that actually talk about now, because at the moment Republicans are hammering this idea, because they're saying that this isn't a real fair number, because this isn't counting the fact that women are going out there having all these babies, and if you actually took that out of the situation, then it would be equal.
The idea that women should generally be penalized for having babies is one that is pretty absurd anyway. But what's interesting is when this has been studied, there's actually a real motherhood penalty, even when they've done blind studies and looked at people who have the same resumes. The only difference is one was clearly a mother and one was clearly a father on the resume. The women who were mothers received lower pay and were seen as less competent, while the men who were fathers got a pay bump. But any notion that women are sort of choosing to be paid less really makes no sense. I know no one who would choose to be paid less. I don't think women are choosing to be about 2/3 of minimum wage workers and choosing to have workplaces that don't do basic things like, I don't know, accommodate pregnancy. So, those sorts of things seem silly to me.
But ma'am, I mean, if women would just get off their behinds and learn how to negotiate, then everything would be great, right?
Yeah, that seems to be the new talking point, too, around negotiation, that the problem is that women just don't negotiate. What's interesting is that there have also been studies that show that women who do negotiate are sometimes perceived as too aggressive because they're acting like men, and that it sometimes backfires. So we're not talking about neutral factors, and we're not talking about neutral markets here.
You know what, you're bringing a lot of weird nuance and facts to the conversation, and I'm not sure that that's actually very helpful when we want to just go in there and we want to burn things down, ma'am. Like, I don't know if you know this, Imani specifically likes to burn things down.
I do, it's true.
Imani enjoys burning things down, and you're just bringing all this nuance and layers, and now we have to sit here and have a reasonable conversation.
I love facts.
You know what? We like you now. If there was one thing that you feel as if people need to take away from, I guess, all the studies and reports that you guys have put out, the whole idea of equal pay day, what would that one thing be?
Our big point is that this wage gap isn't going to go away on its own. And it's going to take a concerted effort. It's going to take an all-out attack on pay discrimination. It's going to take dealing with the fact that women dominate low-paid jobs, and that's especially true for women of color. And it's going to take thinking about how to make workplaces work for working families.
That's just, come on, again, you're just like, that's just madness. Did you not hear that dudes aren't even supposed to take 2 days, 2 baseball games off to stay with their pregnant wife? Like, what are you talking about here? These families things. The ladies are supposed to handle the lady stuff, and the rest of us go and make all the money. Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming on the show. Please don't set me on fire.
Thanks for having me.
So from now on, whenever you hear these horns, just know you are now entering the blackness. Collard greens, cornbread, and the catfish. Malcolm X and